Behind the towering walls of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal secrets lie buried beneath polished marble floors and golden portraits, something extraordinary was about to unfold. For 70 years, Queen Elizabeth II had perfected the art of emotional restraint, her face a masterpiece of composure, even in the most trying moments. Palace staff had grown accustomed to her unwavering dignity, her measured words, and her ability to maintain royal protocol even when her heart was breaking. But on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in November, all of that would change. What happened in the Queen's private study that day would shake the very foundations of everything the royal household thought they knew about their monarch. A single, unexpected visitor would break through decades of carefully constructed emotional barriers, revealing a side of the Queen that even her closest confidants had never witnessed. The tears that fell would not be tears of sorrow, but of something far more profound, a recognition so powerful it would alter the course of royal history forever. This is the story of that moment, told by someone who was there, someone who watched the most composed woman in the world become beautifully, authentically human. A story that begins with protocol and ends with a truth so moving it will change how you see the crown forever. Sarah Matthews had been working at Windsor Castle for 12 years, but she had never seen the Queen cry. Not once. Not even during the most difficult periods of her reign, when family scandals dominated headlines or when personal losses threatened to overwhelm the monarchy. As the Queen's personal secretary, Sarah had witnessed countless private moments, yet Her Majesty's emotional composure remained as steady as the ancient stones of the castle itself. November had arrived with an unusual chill, and the grounds of Windsor were shrouded in the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into one's bones. Sarah arrived at the castle that Tuesday morning at precisely 6:30, as she had every working day for over a decade. The routine was sacred in the royal household, and Sarah took pride in maintaining the clockwork precision that kept the Queen's daily schedule running smoothly. The morning began like any other. Sarah reviewed the day's appointments in her small office adjacent to the Queen's private study. There were meetings with various officials, a video call with the Prime Minister, and the usual correspondence that required the Queen's personal attention. Nothing seemed particularly unusual about the schedule, though Sarah noticed an appointment that had been added late the previous evening. A woman named Margaret Thompson was scheduled for a private audience at 11 o'clock. The entry was brief, noting only that Mrs. Thompson had requested to speak with the Queen about a personal matter related to royal service. Sarah found this curious. Private audiences were typically scheduled weeks, sometimes months in advance, and they usually involved matters of state or significant charitable concerns. For someone to be granted such immediate access to the Queen's personal time was highly unusual. Sarah made a mental note to inquire about the background of this unexpected visitor. At 8 o'clock sharp, Sarah knocked on the door of the Queen's study and entered with a morning briefing folder. The Queen was already seated at her desk, wearing a navy blue wool dress with her signature pearl necklace. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her posture, as always, was impeccably straight. She looked up from the documents she was reviewing and offered Sarah the gentle smile that had become so familiar over the years. "Good morning, Sarah," the Queen said in her distinctive, measured tone. "I trust you had a pleasant evening." "Very pleasant, Your Majesty. Thank you for asking." Sarah placed the briefing folder on the desk and opened it to the first page. "Shall we review today's schedule?" The Queen nodded, and Sarah began reading through the appointments. When she reached the 11 o'clock meeting with Margaret Thompson, she paused slightly, hoping the Queen might offer some explanation about this mysterious addition to the schedule. The Queen simply nodded, showing no particular reaction to the name or the appointment. "Your Majesty, I don't have much background information on Mrs. Thompson. Would you like me to request additional details before the meeting?" The Queen considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "That won't be necessary, Sarah. Mrs. Thompson contacted me directly through a mutual acquaintance. The matter is somewhat personal, and I believe it's important that I see her." This response only deepened Sarah's curiosity, but she knew better than to press for more information. In her years of service, she had learned that the Queen would share what she felt was necessary, and no more. Personal boundaries were respected absolutely in the royal household, and Sarah had built her career on understanding and maintaining those boundaries. The morning proceeded according to schedule. Sarah coordinated with various staff members, managed incoming calls, and ensured that all necessary documents were prepared for the Queen's meetings. At 10:30, she received a call from the main entrance announcing that Mrs. Thompson had arrived and was being escorted to the waiting room. Sarah had developed a habit of observing the Queen's visitors as they arrived, partly out of professional curiosity and partly because it helped her better understand the nature of the meeting she was coordinating. When she glimpsed Margaret Thompson through the window as she crossed the courtyard, Sarah was struck by the woman's appearance. Mrs. Thompson appeared to be in her 70s, with silver-gray hair pulled back in a simple bun. She walked with a slight limp, aided by an elegant wooden cane, but her posture suggested determination rather than frailty. What caught Sarah's attention most was the woman's expression. Margaret Thompson's face carried a mixture of nervousness and resolve that Sarah recognized from other visitors who came to the castle bearing important news or making significant requests. There was something deeply purposeful about her demeanor, as if she carried a weight that could only be lifted by completing this particular mission. At 5 minutes to 11, Sarah knocked on the Queen's study door to announce Mrs. Thompson's arrival. The Queen looked up from her correspondence, and, for just a moment, Sarah caught a glimpse of something unusual in her expression. It wasn't anxiety exactly, but there was a heightened attention, a sense of anticipation that the Queen rarely displayed before routine meetings. "Please show Mrs. Thompson in, Sarah, and I would appreciate if we could have complete privacy for this meeting." Sarah nodded, though the request for complete privacy was somewhat unusual. Typically, Sarah would remain available in the adjacent office in case the Queen needed anything during a meeting. The request for total privacy suggested that this conversation was more significant than the brief notation on the schedule had indicated. Sarah walked to the waiting room, where Margaret Thompson sat quietly, her hands folded over the handle of her cane. When Sarah announced that the Queen was ready to see her, Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath and rose slowly to her feet. As they walked down the corridor toward the Queen's study, Sarah noticed that the older woman's hands were trembling slightly. "Mrs. Thompson," Sarah said gently, "Her Majesty is looking forward to meeting with you." Margaret Thompson looked at Sarah with eyes that seemed to hold decades of stories. "I've been waiting a very long time for this moment," she replied quietly. "Longer than you might imagine." At the door to the Queen's study, Sarah knocked softly and announced Mrs. Thompson's arrival. She opened the door and stepped aside to allow the visitor to enter. As Margaret Thompson crossed the threshold, Sarah caught a glimpse of the Queen rising from her chair behind the desk, her expression carefully composed but somehow more alert than usual. "Mrs. Thompson," the Queen said, extending her hand in greeting. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Sarah closed the door softly and returned to her office, but something about the meeting troubled her. There had been an undercurrent of emotion in both women that she couldn't quite identify. The Queen's usual calm demeanor seemed to carry an edge of anticipation, while Mrs. Thompson appeared to be steeling herself for a conversation of great importance. For the next 30 minutes, Sarah worked at her desk, but she found it difficult to concentrate on routine tasks. The unusual nature of the meeting, combined with the Queen's request for complete privacy, created an atmosphere of expectancy that seemed to permeate the entire wing of the castle. Sarah had learned to read the emotional temperature of the royal household with remarkable accuracy, and something significant was happening behind the closed door of the Queen's study. At 11:45, Sarah heard voices from within the study, though she couldn't make out the words. The tone seemed serious, but not confrontational. A few minutes later, there was a period of complete silence that stretched on longer than seemed natural. Sarah began to wonder if she should check on the meeting, but before she could decide, she heard something that stopped her cold. It was the sound of someone crying softly, The sound was so unexpected, so completely out of place in the controlled environment of the royal household, that Sarah initially thought she might have imagined it. But as she listened more carefully, she could distinctly hear the quiet sounds of someone weeping. Sarah's first instinct was professional concern. If Mrs. Thompson had become upset during the meeting, it might be necessary to provide assistance or medical attention. But as she listened more carefully, a shocking realization began to dawn on her. The crying wasn't coming from the visitor. The tears were coming from the Queen. In 12 years of service, through personal crises and public challenges, through moments of joy and periods of profound sadness, Sarah had never heard the Queen cry. The sound was so foreign to her experience of working with Her Majesty that she initially questioned her own perception. But there was no mistaking it. Behind the closed door of her private study, Queen Elizabeth II was weeping. Sarah sat frozen at her desk, uncertain how to process what she was hearing. The professional part of her mind recognized that this was clearly a private moment that required absolute discretion. But the human part of her, the part that had grown genuinely fond of the woman she served, was deeply concerned about what could have prompted such an unprecedented emotional response. The crying continued for several more minutes, occasionally punctuated by the soft murmur of voices. Sarah could hear Mrs. Thompson speaking in gentle, soothing tones, though the words remained indistinguishable. Whatever had transpired in that room had clearly moved the Queen in a way that Sarah had never witnessed before. As the sound from the study gradually subsided, Sarah found herself reconsidering everything she thought she knew about the woman she had served for 12 years. The Queen's emotional restraint had always been one of her most remarkable qualities, a source of stability and strength that seemed to anchor the entire institution of the monarchy. To hear that composure break so completely suggested that whatever Mrs. Thompson had shared was of extraordinary significance. Sarah realized that she was witnessing a moment that would likely never be repeated in her lifetime. She was experiencing firsthand the revelation that even the most composed, most controlled person in the world was, underneath it all, profoundly human. The realization was both moving and slightly overwhelming, as it challenged her understanding of the woman she had come to know so well through their professional relationship. When the door to the study finally opened 20 minutes later, Sarah looked up to see Mrs. Thompson emerging with tears still visible on her cheeks. Behind her, the Queen appeared in the doorway, her own eyes red-rimmed, but her posture as straight and dignified as ever. There was something different about her expression, however, a softness that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "Mrs. Thompson," the Queen said, her voice slightly hoarse but steady, "thank you for sharing your story with me. It means more than you can possibly know." Margaret Thompson turned back to face the Queen, and Sarah watched as the two women embraced gently. It was a gesture so natural and heartfelt that it seemed to transcend the usual formality of royal encounters. When they separated, both women were smiling through their tears. "Your Majesty," Mrs. Thompson said, "I'm so grateful that you were willing to see me. I've carried this story for so many years, and knowing that you understand its importance brings me such peace." The Queen walked Mrs. Thompson to the door, an honor she typically reserved for only the most distinguished guests. As they reached the threshold, the Queen placed her hand gently on the older woman's arm. "Margaret," she said, using the woman's first name for the first time, "you have given me a gift today that I will treasure for the rest of my life. Thank you for your courage in coming here." After Mrs. Thompson had been escorted from the building, Sarah remained at her desk, processing what she had witnessed. The Queen had returned to her study and closed the door, clearly needing some private time to compose herself. Sarah respected this need for solitude, but she couldn't stop thinking about the profound change she had observed in Her Majesty during those brief moments after the meeting. When the Queen finally emerged from her study an hour later, she appeared to have fully regained her characteristic composure. Her hair was perfect, her makeup had been refreshed, and her bearing was as regal as ever. But Sarah noticed something different in her eyes, a depth of emotion that seemed to have been newly awakened. "Sarah," the Queen said as she passed through the outer office, "would you please cancel my remaining appointment for the day? I find that I need some time to reflect on this morning's conversation." "Of course, Your Majesty. Shall I reschedule them for tomorrow?" "Yes, that will be fine." "And, Sarah," the Queen paused at the door, "the meeting with Mrs. Thompson should remain strictly confidential. The matters we discussed were deeply personal." "Absolutely, Your Majesty. You have my complete discretion." The Queen nodded and walked away, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and questions. As she began making calls to reschedule the afternoon appointments, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary morning she had witnessed. She knew that she had been present for a moment of genuine human connection that had somehow managed to break through decades of royal protocol and emotional restraint. Whatever Margaret Thompson had shared with the Queen had clearly been profound enough to move Her Majesty to tears. As Sarah worked through the administrative tasks required to clear the Queen's schedule, she found herself wondering about the story that could have such a powerful impact on someone who had spent a lifetime managing her emotional responses with remarkable discipline. The afternoon passed quietly, with the Queen remaining in her private apartments and Sarah handling routine correspondence and scheduling matters. As the day came to an end and Sarah prepared to leave the castle, she reflected on how dramatically her understanding of the Queen had expanded in just a few hours. She had always respected Her Majesty's strength and composure, but witnessing her vulnerability had somehow made that strength even more remarkable. The Queen's ability to be moved to tears by a stranger's story, to embrace that vulnerability completely, and then to regain her composure while clearly carrying the emotional impact of the encounter, demonstrated a depth of humanity that Sarah had never fully appreciated. As Sarah drove home through the darkening November evening, she carried with her the memory of a moment that had revealed the profound humanity hiding beneath the crown. She knew that she would never speak of what she had witnessed, but she also knew that the experience had changed her own understanding of both the woman she served and the nature of true strength. The rain continued to fall as she made her way home, and Sarah found herself thinking about Margaret Thompson and the mysterious story that had moved a queen to tears. Whatever secrets had been shared in that private study would likely remain between those two women forever, but the impact of their encounter would ripple outward in ways that might not be fully understood for years to come. The following morning arrived with unexpected sunshine, casting long golden rays through the tall windows of Windsor Castle. Sarah arrived to find the Queen already in her study, but there was something markedly different about her demeanor. The composed, measured presence that had defined Her Majesty for decades seemed somehow softer, more accessible. When Sarah knocked and entered with the morning briefings, the Queen looked up with a smile that seemed to come from a deeper place than usual. "Good morning, Sarah," the Queen said, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed newly awakened. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you, Your Majesty." Sarah placed the briefing folder on the desk, noticing that the Queen's eyes held a brightness she had rarely seen before. "How are you feeling this morning?" The Queen paused in a way that suggested she was considering the question more deeply than the usual pleasantries would warrant. "I feel remarkably refreshed, actually. Yesterday's conversation with Mrs. Thompson was quite extraordinary, and I find myself seeing many things with fresh perspective this morning." Sarah nodded, her curiosity about the previous day's meeting still burning brightly, but she knew better than to ask direct questions. Instead, she opened the briefing folder and began reviewing the day's schedule. As she read through the appointments, she noticed that the Queen seemed to be listening with particular attention to items involving public engagements and meetings with ordinary citizens. "Your Majesty," Sarah said, reaching the afternoon schedule, "you have a visit to the local community center at 3 o'clock. The organizers are expecting you to meet with several elderly residents who have been involved in community service for many years." "Ah, yes," the Queen replied, her eyes lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. "I'm particularly looking forward to that engagement." Sometimes the most meaningful conversations come from the most unexpected sources. This comment struck Sarah as significant, given the events of the previous day. It seemed that Mrs. Thompson's visit had awakened something in the Queen, a renewed appreciation for personal connections that transcended formal protocol. Sarah made a mental note to pay special attention to the Queen's interactions during the afternoon visit. The morning proceeded with routine meetings, but Sarah couldn't help but notice subtle changes in the Queen's approach to each encounter. She seemed more present, more engaged, asking questions that went beyond the expected royal inquiries. When meeting with a group of local officials about community development projects, the Queen spent considerably more time than usual asking about the people who would be affected by the proposed changes. "Tell me about the families who live in this area," the Queen requested during one briefing. "What are their stories? What challenges do they face in their daily lives?" The officials seemed somewhat taken aback by these more personal questions, but they responded with enthusiasm, clearly pleased by the Queen's evident interest in the human aspects of their work. Sarah watched from her position near the door, fascinated by this new dimension to the Queen's public engagement. During the lunch break, Sarah was organizing papers in her office when she heard the Queen speaking quietly on the telephone. The conversation seemed personal rather than official, and Sarah caught fragments that suggested the Queen was making arrangements to meet with someone. The tone was gentle and inviting, quite different from the formal language typically used for royal appointments. "I would very much like to hear your story," Sarah heard the Queen saying. "Sometimes we don't realize how much we need to understand until someone opens our eyes to a different perspective." When the Queen ended the call, Sarah knocked softly and entered to confirm the afternoon's arrangements. The Queen looked up with an expression that was difficult to read, a mixture of anticipation and something that might have been nervous excitement. "Sarah, I may need to make some adjustments to next week's schedule. There are some people I'd like to meet with, individuals whose experiences might help me better understand certain aspects of life in our country that I haven't fully appreciated." "Of course, Your Majesty. Shall I begin making preliminary arrangements?" "Not yet. I need to think through exactly how to approach this properly. Mrs. Thompson's visit yesterday reminded me that there are stories all around us that we never hear, experiences that could teach us so much if we only took the time to listen." Sarah nodded, increasingly convinced that yesterday's meeting had triggered something profound in the Queen's approach to her role. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable, as if a door had been opened to a part of her personality that had been carefully contained for decades. The afternoon visit to the community center proved to be a revelation. Sarah accompanied the Queen, as was customary for such engagements, and she found herself witnessing interactions that were markedly different from the usual royal visits. Instead of the typical brief, polite exchanges, the Queen seemed genuinely curious about each person she met. When introduced to Mrs. Eleanor Davies, an 80-year-old woman who had spent 40 years organizing meals for homeless individuals in the area, the Queen didn't simply acknowledge her service and move on. Instead, she asked Mrs. Davies to sit with her for a few minutes and tell her about the people she had helped over the years. "Tell me about someone whose story particularly touched you," the Queen requested, settling into a chair beside the elderly volunteer. "I'd like to understand what motivates people to dedicate so much of their lives to helping others." Mrs. Davies's eyes widened with surprise and pleasure at the unexpected invitation to share her experiences. She began telling the Queen about a young mother who had arrived at the community center 5 years earlier with 3 small children, having fled an abusive relationship with nothing but the clothes they were wearing. "She was so frightened," Mrs. Davies explained, barely able to speak above a whisper. "But over the months, as she found safety and support, she began to bloom. Today, she's studying to become a social worker herself, wanting to help other women in similar situations. Watching her transformation taught me that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change someone's entire life path." The Queen listened with complete attention, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest in both the woman's story and Mrs. Davies' perspective on helping others. Sarah watched this interaction with growing amazement, realizing that she was seeing the Queen engage with a member of the public in a way that was unprecedented in her experience. "Mrs. Davies," the Queen said thoughtfully, "would you be willing to introduce me to this young mother? I'd very much like to hear her story myself." "Oh, Your Majesty, she would be absolutely thrilled. She's actually here today, helping in the kitchen. Would you like me to ask her to join us?" "I would be honored to meet her." When Sandra Williams was brought forward, clearly nervous and overwhelmed at the prospect of meeting the Queen, Her Majesty immediately put her at ease with a warm smile and a gentle invitation to sit down. "Mrs. Williams, I understand that you've shown remarkable courage in rebuilding your life. I'd be grateful if you would share your story with me. Sometimes those of us in positions of privilege need to better understand the challenges that ordinary people face." What followed was a 20-minute conversation that moved everyone who witnessed it. Sandra Williams, initially hesitant and clearly awed by the situation, gradually began to open up as the Queen asked thoughtful, compassionate questions about her experiences. The Queen listened without judgment, asked for clarification when she didn't understand something, and expressed genuine admiration for Sandra's strength and determination. "Your Majesty," Sandra said at one point, tears forming in her eyes, "I never imagined that someone like you would care about someone like me. It means everything to know that our struggles matter to you." The Queen reached over and gently took Sandra's hand. "Your struggles matter tremendously. Your courage in rebuilding your life, your dedication to helping others who face similar challenges, your commitment to your children despite everything you've endured. These are the things that make our country strong. I'm the one who should be thanking you." Sarah found herself deeply moved by this exchange, recognizing that she was witnessing something extraordinary. The Queen had always been gracious and kind in her public interactions, but this level of personal engagement and emotional connection was entirely new. Whatever had happened during yesterday's meeting with Margaret Thompson had clearly awakened a different approach to her role as monarch. As the visit continued, the Queen sought out opportunities to engage in similar conversations with other community center participants. She spent time with a teenager who had overcome addiction and was now mentoring other young people, with an elderly man who had served as an informal counselor for troubled family for 30 years, and with a middle-aged woman who had organized literacy programs for immigrants learning English. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. The Queen would ask to hear the person's story, listen with complete attention, and respond with genuine interest and appreciation. She seemed particularly drawn to stories of resilience, of people who had faced significant challenges and found ways to not only survive, but to help others in similar situations. During the drive back to Windsor Castle, the Queen was unusually reflective. She gazed out the window at the countryside, occasionally making observations about the communities they passed through. "Sarah," she said suddenly, "I realize I've spent 70 years in this role without truly understanding the depth of human experience that exists all around us. Yesterday's conversation with Mrs. Thompson opened my eyes to how much I've been missing. Your Majesty, if I may ask, what was it about Mrs. Thompson's story that had such an impact on you?" The Queen considered this question for a long moment before responding. "She helped me understand that the distance I've maintained between myself and the people I serve, while necessary for maintaining dignity and protocol, may have also prevented me from truly understanding the lives I'm meant to represent." Sarah sensed that there was much more to the story, but she respected the Queen's privacy too much to press for additional details. Instead, she focused on the implications of what she was observing. "You seem to really connect with the people we met today in a way that was quite beautiful to witness." "Yes," the Queen agreed, "and I find myself wondering how many similar opportunities I've missed over the years. How many stories have I not heard because I was too focused on maintaining appropriate distance? How many connections have I failed to make because I was overly concerned with protocol?" When they arrived back at Windsor, the Queen retreated to her study, but this time she left the door partially open, which was unusual. Sarah could hear her making phone calls, and from the fragments she could overhear, It seemed that the Queen was reaching out to various people to arrange informal meetings. "I'd very much like to hear about your work with homeless veterans," Sarah heard the Queen saying during one call. "Would you be willing to meet with me sometime next week? I'm hoping to better understand the challenges they face and the ways we might be able to provide more effective support." Throughout the afternoon, similar calls continued. The Queen was clearly energized by the day's experiences and eager to build on the connection she had made. Sarah had never seen her so personally invested in the human aspects of her role. As the day came to an end, Sarah was preparing to leave when the Queen emerged from her study with an expression of thoughtful determination. "Sarah, I'd like to make some significant changes to my schedule over the next several weeks. I want to spend more time meeting with individuals who can help me better understand the real experiences of people in our country. Not formal state visits or official ceremonies, but genuine conversations with people who have stories to tell." "Of course, Your Majesty. What kind of meetings are you envisioning?" "I'd like to meet with people from all walks of life. Single mothers, elderly individuals living alone, young people facing unemployment, families dealing with serious illnesses, veterans adjusting to civilian life, immigrants building new lives here. People whose experiences can teach me things I need to know but have never learned." Sarah was struck by the scope and ambition of what the Queen was proposing. This represented a fundamental shift in how she approached her role, moving from formal, ceremonial interactions to deeply personal, meaningful conversations. "This is quite a departure from your usual schedule, Your Majesty. Are you sure you want to make such significant changes?" The Queen smiled, and Sarah noticed that her expression carried a peace and certainty that seemed to have emerged from yesterday's mysterious encounter. "Sarah, I'm more certain of this than I've been about anything in years. Mrs. Thompson helped me realize that I've been serving from a distance, when what's really needed is service from the heart. I want to spend whatever time I've left in this role truly understanding the people I serve, not just representing them in the abstract." As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on the remarkable transformation she had witnessed over the past 2 days. The Queen's tears during yesterday's meeting with Margaret Thompson had apparently marked the beginning of a profound shift in her approach to the monarchy. Whatever story Mrs. Thompson had shared had clearly convinced the Queen that genuine human connection was not incompatible with royal duty, but rather essential to it. Sarah found herself deeply moved by the Queen's newfound commitment to personal engagement with her subjects. The afternoon's visit to the community center had revealed a side of Her Majesty that was both regal and remarkably human, someone capable of maintaining her dignity while also opening her heart to the experiences of others. As she considered what might unfold in the coming weeks, Sarah realized that she was witnessing the beginning of a new chapter in the Queen's reign, one that might ultimately redefine what it meant to serve as a modern monarch. The tears that had been shed in the Queen's study had apparently washed away barriers that had existed for decades, creating space for a kind of leadership that was both deeply personal and profoundly meaningful. Whatever secrets Margaret Thompson had shared were clearly continuing to influence the Queen's perspective, inspiring her to reach beyond the traditional boundaries of royal engagement towards something more authentic and transformative. Sarah looked forward to being part of this new approach, even as she wondered what other surprises this remarkable transformation might bring. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret Thompson's visit, and the transformation in the Queen's approach to her royal duties had become increasingly evident to everyone who worked closely with her. Sarah found herself coordinating a type of engagement she had never managed before, arranging private meetings between the Queen and ordinary citizens whose stories represented different aspects of the human experience. The Queen's private study had been rearranged to accommodate these more intimate conversations. The formal desk that had previously dominated the room had been supplemented with comfortable chairs arranged around a small coffee table, creating a setting that invited genuine dialogue rather than formal audiences. Fresh flowers appeared on the table each morning, and the Queen had requested that tea and biscuits be available for every guest, regardless of their background or circumstances. On this particular Wednesday morning, Sarah was reviewing the day's schedule when she noticed an appointment that gave her pause. At 2 o'clock, the Queen was scheduled to meet with James Mitchell, a 35-year-old father of three who had been homeless for 6 months after losing his job in a factory closure. The meeting had been arranged through a local homeless shelter, and Sarah had spoken with Mr. Mitchell the previous day to confirm the appointment. During that phone call, James had expressed such disbelief at the invitation that Sarah had needed to reassure him multiple times that the request was genuine. "Why would the Queen want to meet with someone like me?" he had asked repeatedly. Sarah had explained that Her Majesty was committed to better understanding the experiences of all her subjects, but she could hear in his voice that he still found the entire situation difficult to believe. The morning meetings proceeded smoothly, but Sarah noticed that the Queen seemed particularly focused on the afternoon appointment. During a brief break between meetings, the Queen asked Sarah about the arrangements for Mr. Mitchell's visit. "I want to ensure that he feels completely comfortable," the Queen said. "This kind of meeting can be overwhelming for people who aren't accustomed to royal protocol. Have we made it clear that this is simply a conversation between two people? I've emphasized that to Mr. Mitchell, Your Majesty, though I suspect he'll still be quite nervous. He seemed genuinely shocked that you wanted to hear his story. That's exactly why these conversations are so important, Sarah. If people are surprised that their monarch cares about their experiences, then I clearly haven't been doing my job properly." At 1:30, Sarah received a call from the main entrance announcing that James Mitchell had arrived. She went to meet him personally, wanting to provide whatever reassurance she could before his meeting with the Queen. When she saw him standing in the grand entrance hall, she immediately understood his nervousness. He was wearing what was clearly his best outfit, a somewhat worn but clean button-down shirt and slacks, and he was looking around at the opulent surroundings with an expression of complete amazement. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said, approaching him with a warm smile. "Thank you so much for coming. Her Majesty is looking forward to meeting you." James turned toward her, his face showing a mixture of excitement and terror. "I still can't believe this is really happening. Are you sure she wants to see me? I mean, I'm nobody special. I'm just a guy who lost his job and can't find another one." "Mr. Mitchell, that's exactly why your perspective is so valuable to Her Majesty. She wants to understand what life is really like for people facing the challenges you're dealing with." As they walked through the corridors toward the Queen's study, Sarah continued to offer gentle reassurance, but she could see that James was struggling to process the reality of his situation. His hands were trembling slightly, and he kept looking around at the portraits and furnishings as if trying to convince himself that he really belonged in such surroundings. When they reached the Queen's study, Sarah knocked softly and announced James's arrival. The Queen's voice invited them to enter, and Sarah opened the door to reveal Her Majesty standing near the comfortable seating area she had arranged for these personal meetings. She was wearing a simple blue dress with minimal jewelry, and her expression was warm and welcoming. "Mr. Mitchell," the Queen said, stepping forward to greet him. "Thank you so much for coming. I'm delighted to meet you." James stood frozen for a moment, clearly overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the situation. The Queen seemed to recognize his discomfort immediately and addressed it directly. "I know this must feel quite strange," she said gently. "Please come and sit down. I've asked them to bring us some tea, and I was hoping we could simply have a conversation. I'd very much like to hear about your experiences, if you're willing to share them." James allowed himself to be guided to one of the chairs, and Sarah quietly withdrew, closing the door behind her. As she settled at her desk in the adjacent office, she reflected on how naturally the Queen had handled James's nervousness, immediately putting him at ease with her genuine warmth and interest. For the first few minutes, Sarah could hear the quiet murmur of conversation as the Queen helped James become more comfortable. Gradually, his responses became longer and more confident as he began to trust that the Queen's interest in his story was genuine. After about 15 minutes, Sarah heard James's voice become more animated as he began describing his work history. He had been employed at the same factory for 12 years, working his way up from entry-level positions to become a floor supervisor. The job had provided not just income, but also a sense of identity and purpose that had been central to his understanding of himself as a provider for his family. "I was good at what I did," Sarah heard him saying. "The workers respected me, management trusted me, and I took pride in keeping production running smoothly. When they announced the closure, I couldn't believe it at first. I thought maybe there would be another factory that would need someone with my experience." The Queen's responses were thoughtful and encouraging, asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest in understanding not just the practical aspects of job loss, but also the emotional impact of such a fundamental change in someone's life. It must have been devastating to lose not just the income, but also the sense of purpose that comes from work you're good at, Sarah heard the Queen saying. "How did you cope with that emotional aspect of the loss?" James's response was clearly heartfelt, and Sarah could hear the pain in his voice as he described the gradual erosion of his self-confidence as months passed without finding new employment. He talked about the difficulty of explaining to his children why they had to move out of their house, why he couldn't buy them the things they needed, why their entire life had been turned upside down through no fault of their own. "The hardest part," James said, his voice breaking slightly, "was seeing my wife trying to be strong for all of us while I felt like I was failing at the most basic thing a husband and father is supposed to do, provide for his family." There was a moment of silence, and then Sarah heard the Queen's voice, soft and compassionate. "You haven't failed, Mr. Mitchell. You've faced an impossible situation with remarkable dignity, and you're still fighting to rebuild your family's security. That's not failure, that's courage." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with James describing the realities of homelessness that most people never see or consider. He talked about the practical challenges, finding safe places to sleep, maintaining personal hygiene without permanent facilities, keeping his children in school despite their unstable living situation. But he also shared the emotional toll of losing not just housing, but also the social connections and sense of belonging that come with having a permanent address. "People look at you differently when they know you don't have a home," James explained. "Even when they want to help, there's often a kind of pity or discomfort that makes you feel like you're not quite human anymore. It's hard to maintain your dignity when the world sees you as a problem to be solved rather than a person with value." The Queen listened to these insights with obvious attention, asking follow-up questions that suggested she was genuinely trying to understand perspectives she had never encountered before. Sarah found herself deeply moved by the quality of the conversation she was overhearing, recognizing that both participants were being transformed by the experience of genuine connection across vastly different life circumstances. When James began describing his children's resilience in the face of their family's challenges, his voice filled with pride despite their difficult circumstances. He talked about his 8-year-old daughter who continued to excel in school despite the disruption to their lives, his 10-year-old son who had taken on additional responsibilities to help the family, and his 12-year-old daughter who had organized a small fundraiser at school to help other homeless families in their community. "They've taught me so much about courage," James said. "They haven't let these circumstances define them or limit their dreams. My oldest daughter still talks about becoming a doctor. My son wants to be an engineer, and my youngest is determined to become a teacher. They believe in better futures despite everything they've seen." The Queen's response to this was clearly emotional. "Your children sound extraordinary, Mr. Mitchell, but children learn courage from their parents. They're displaying the strength they've learned from watching you and your wife face impossible challenges with dignity and determination." As the meeting continued, the conversation turned to James's hopes for the future and his perspective on what kinds of support will be most helpful for families in situations like his. The Queen asked thoughtful questions about employment assistance, housing programs, and support services for children experiencing homelessness. "What would make the biggest difference for families like yours?" the Queen asked. "If you could design support systems that would genuinely help people rebuild their lives, what would those look like?" James's responses demonstrated a deep understanding of the systemic issues that contribute to homelessness and the gaps in existing support services. He talked about the need for job training programs that recognize the skills that displaced workers already possess, housing assistance that doesn't separate families, and Support for children that helps them maintain stability in their education despite changes in their living situations. Most people who end up homeless aren't lazy or irresponsible, James explained. They're people who worked hard and played by the rules until something happened that was beyond their control. A factory closure, a serious illness, a family crisis. What we need is support that recognizes that and helps us get back on our feet rather than just managing our poverty. The Queen's engagement with these ideas was clearly genuine, and Sarah could hear her taking notes as James spoke. It was evident that this conversation was providing Her Majesty with insights into social issues that she had never fully understood despite decades of formal briefings on poverty and homelessness. When a meeting concluded after nearly an hour and a half, Sarah heard chairs being moved and footsteps approaching the door. When it opened, both James and the Queen appeared visibly moved by their conversation. James's initial nervousness had been replaced by a sense of dignity and purpose that came from being truly heard and understood. "Mr. Mitchell," the Queen said as they reached the door, "thank you for sharing your story with me. Your insights will help me better understand how we might improve support for families facing similar challenges. I hope you'll stay in touch and let me know how things progress for your family." James looked at the Queen with an expression of profound gratitude. "Your Majesty, I never imagined that someone in your position would care enough to really listen to someone like me. This conversation has meant more to me than I can express. It's reminded me that I still have value as a person, even though I'm going through a difficult time." The Queen extended her hand to shake his, then surprised everyone by pulling him into a gentle embrace. "You have tremendous value, Mr. Mitchell. Your love for your family, your determination to rebuild your lives, your insights into how we can better support people facing similar challenges. These are gifts you're offering to all of us. Thank you for trusting me with your story." After James had been escorted from the castle, the Queen returned to her study, but she left the door open and asked Sarah to join her. When Sarah entered, she found the Queen sitting in one of the comfortable chairs where she had been meeting with James, staring thoughtfully out the window. "Sarah," the Queen said without looking away from the window, "that conversation has given me more insight into the real impact of economic policy than all the government briefings I've received over the past decade. James Mitchell helped me understand that we're not just talking about statistics when we discuss unemployment or homelessness. We're talking about families, about children, about human dignity." Sarah took a seat in the chair that James had occupied, still feeling the residual emotional energy from the powerful conversation that had just concluded. "It was quite moving to witness, Your Majesty. Mr. Mitchell's perspective was extraordinary, and your willingness to truly listen and engage with his experiences was remarkable." "It's not remarkable, Sarah. It's what I should have been doing all along. Margaret Thompson helped me realize that I've been serving at a distance, relying on reports and briefings to understand my people's experiences rather than actually listening to them directly. These conversations are teaching me things I never learned in all my years of formal education about statecraft." The Queen turned from the window to face Sarah directly. "I want to accelerate this process. I want to meet with more people like James, individuals whose experiences can teach me about aspects of life in our country that I've never truly understood. Can you help me arrange more of these conversations?" "Of course, Your Majesty. What kinds of experiences are you most interested in learning about?" The Queen considered this question carefully. "I want to understand what it's really like to face serious illness without adequate health care, to be elderly and alone, to be a young person trying to build a career in an economy that doesn't seem to offer the same opportunities it once did. I want to hear from immigrants about what it's like to build a new life in a foreign country, from veterans about transitioning to civilian life, from parents trying to raise children while working multiple jobs just to make ends meet." Sarah was struck by the breadth and depth of the Queen's new interest in her subjects' lived experiences. This represented a fundamental shift, not just in her schedule, but in her entire approach to understanding her role as monarch. "This is quite an ambitious undertaking, Your Majesty. These kinds of conversations will require a significant time commitment." "Time is exactly what I want to commit to this, Sarah. I'm realizing that the most important thing I can do in whatever years I have left is to truly understand the people I serve. Not just represent them symbolically, but actually know them, learn from them, and let their experiences guide how I think about my responsibilities. As Sarah began to consider the logistics of arranging such a comprehensive series of personal meetings, she reflected on the remarkable transformation she had witnessed over the past few weeks. The Queen's encounter with Margaret Thompson had clearly been the catalyst for a complete reimagining of how she wanted to spend her remaining years as monarch. The tears that had been shed in this very room had apparently marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the Queen would seek to bridge the distance between the crown and the people it represented through genuine human connection. Sarah looked forward to helping facilitate these meetings, knowing that she was supporting something that would likely have a lasting impact on both the Queen and the individuals whose stories she would hear. As the afternoon sun began to set over Windsor Castle, Sarah realized that she was witnessing history in the making, not the grand, ceremonial kind of history that would fill textbooks, but the intimate, personal kind of history that happens when one human being opens their heart to truly understanding another. The Queen's willingness to be transformed by these encounters represented a kind of leadership that was both ancient and revolutionary, grounded in the simple but profound act of listening with genuine compassion to the experiences of others. 6 weeks after Margaret Thompson's transformative visit, the Queen's new approach to personal engagement had become a defining characteristic of her daily routine. Sarah had coordinated dozens of intimate meetings, each one adding another layer to the Queen's understanding of the human experience in modern Britain. But it was the meeting scheduled for this Thursday morning that would prove to be the most challenging and ultimately the most profound of all these encounters. Dr. Amara Hassan was a refugee from Syria who had arrived in Britain 3 years earlier with her 2 young children, having fled the devastating civil war that had destroyed her homeland. Despite holding a medical degree from Damascus University and having practiced as a pediatric surgeon for 8 years before the conflict, Dr. Hassan had been unable to obtain recognition for her qualifications in Britain and was currently working as a hospital cleaner while studying to pass the medical examinations that would allow her to practice again. Sarah had first heard Dr. Hassan's story through a charity organization that supported refugee professionals, and she had been struck by the woman's remarkable resilience in the face of overwhelming challenges. When she suggested the meeting to the Queen, Her Majesty had immediately expressed deep interest in understanding the experiences of someone who had lost everything yet continued to fight for the opportunity to rebuild her professional life. The morning of the meeting arrived with a light snow falling across the castle grounds, and Sarah noticed that the Queen seemed more thoughtful than usual as they reviewed the day's schedule. When they reached Dr. Hassan's appointment, the Queen paused and looked directly at Sarah. "I've been thinking about this meeting all week," the Queen admitted. "Dr. Hassan represents something I've never fully understood. The experience of losing one's entire world and having to rebuild from nothing in a foreign country. I want to ensure that I approach this conversation with appropriate sensitivity. She's remarkable, Your Majesty. Despite everything she's been through, she maintains such dignity and determination. I think you'll find her perspective quite enlightening." When Dr. Hassan arrived at the castle, Sarah was immediately struck by her presence. Despite wearing a simple black dress that was clearly not expensive, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to respect and responsibility. Her dark eyes reflected both intelligence and a deep weariness that spoke to the struggles she had endured. "Dr. Hassan," Sarah said as she greeted her in the entrance hall, "thank you for coming. Her Majesty is very much looking forward to hearing your story." "I am honored by this invitation," Dr. Hassan replied in English that was heavily accented but precisely spoken. "I still find it difficult to believe that the Queen wishes to meet with someone in my circumstances." As they walked through the corridors toward the Queen's study, Dr. Hassan looked around at the magnificent surroundings with an expression that was difficult to read. There was appreciation for the beauty and history represented in the architecture and artwork, but also something that might have been a bittersweet recognition of the vast distance between this world and her current reality. When they reached the Queen's study, Sarah knocked and announced their arrival. The Queen's invitation to enter was warm and immediate, and when the door opened, Dr. Hassan found herself face-to-face with a monarch who had invited her to share her most painful and personal experiences. Dr. Hassan, the Queen said, stepping forward with both hands extended in welcome. I'm deeply grateful that you were willing to meet with me. Please come and sit down. I've been looking forward to this conversation all week. As Dr. Hassan took her seat in the comfortable chair opposite the Queen, Sarah noticed that despite her obvious nervousness, she maintained the poised bearing of someone accustomed to positions of responsibility and respect. The Queen seemed to recognize this immediately and addressed it directly. I understand that you were a practicing surgeon in Syria before the conflict forced you to leave. That must have been an incredibly difficult transition, losing not just your home and country, but also your professional identity and purpose. Dr. Hassan's eyes filled with tears at this acknowledgement of what her losses had truly encompassed. Your Majesty, you understand something that many people do not. Yes, leaving my country was heartbreaking, but losing my ability to practice medicine, to save children's lives, to use the skills I had spent so many years developing, that has been a different kind of devastation. The Queen leaned forward slightly, her attention completely focused on Dr. Hassan's words. Tell me about your life before the war. Help me understand what you lost when you were forced to leave. What followed was a conversation that revealed the full scope of Dr. Hassan's previous life and the magnitude of what the conflict had taken from her. She described her medical practice in Damascus, where she had been part of a team that performed complex pediatric surgeries and provided hope for families facing their worst fears about their children's health. I had a beautiful life, Dr. Hassan said, her voice carrying both grief and pride. I worked at Children's Hospital, and we were known throughout the region for our pediatric cardiac surgery program. Parents would bring their children from across Syria and neighboring countries, trusting us with their most precious gifts. Every successful surgery, every child who went home healthy, it gave meaning to everything I had worked for. The Queen listened with visible emotion as Dr. Hassan described not just her professional accomplishments, but also her personal life in Damascus. She had been married to an engineering professor at the university, and they had built a life filled with professional fulfillment, close friendships, extended family connections, and deep roots in a community they loved. We live in a beautiful old house near the university, Dr. Hassan continued. My husband's parents lived nearby. My sister and her family were just a few streets away. Our children grew up surrounded by cousins and grandparents who adored them. It was the kind of life where every day brought small joys and the future seemed full of possibility. The Queen asked gentle questions about Dr. Hassan's children, learning that her 8-year-old daughter had been showing signs of exceptional academic ability and her 10-year-old son had been passionate about mathematics and science. The family had been planning for both children to pursue university education, perhaps even following in their parents' professional footsteps. Tell me about the decision to leave, the Queen said softly. That must have been impossibly difficult. Dr. Hassan's composure finally broke as she described the deteriorating situation in Damascus and the specific incident that had forced their departure. A bomb had destroyed the children's hospital where she worked, killing several of her colleagues and eliminating any hope that she could continue practicing medicine in Syria. I remember standing in the rubble of the hospital where I had saved so many children's lives, Dr. Hassan said through tears. My hands, which had performed delicate surgeries, were bleeding from digging through debris looking for survivors. That's when I knew we couldn't stay. The war had taken everything: our safety, our community, our ability to practice the professions we loved. If we stayed, it would eventually take our children's lives as well. The Queen reached across the small table between them and took Dr. Hassan's hands in her own. I cannot imagine the courage it took to leave everything you had built and venture into the unknown to protect your children. Your Majesty, when you are a mother, you find strength you never knew you had. But the guilt of taking my children away from their grandparents, their cousins, their entire world, that guilt has never left me. The conversation then turned to Dr. Hassan's experiences as a refugee in Britain, and the Queen listened with growing distress as she learned about the obstacles that prevented qualified professionals from practicing their vocations in their new country. Despite Dr. Hassan's extensive medical training and years of surgical experience, she was required to essentially start her medical education over again, passing a series of examinations that would take years to complete while supporting her family through whatever employment she could find. "I understand that you're currently working as a cleaner in a hospital," the Queen said. "That must be particularly painful, being surrounded by the medical environment where you belong, but being unable to practice." "It is heartbreaking, Your Majesty. Every day, I see medical situations where I know I could help, but I cannot act. I watch children being prepared for surgeries that I have performed hundreds of times, but I must remain silent and continue cleaning the floors. It feels like watching my former life through glass, always visible but never accessible." Dr. Hassan described the practical challenges of studying for medical examinations while working full-time in menial employment and raising two children who were struggling to adapt to their new culture and language. She explained how the British medical system, while rigorous and well-intentioned, made little accommodation for the experiences and skills that refugee doctors had developed in their home countries. "The examinations I must pass are the same ones required of new medical students, despite my 8 years of surgical practice. It will take me at least 3 more years to complete this process if I can manage to pass all the requirements while working and caring for my family. By then, my surgical skills will have deteriorated from lack of practice." The Queen was clearly troubled by this information. So the system essentially wastes the expertise and experience you've already developed, forcing you to prove competencies you've already demonstrated in your professional practice? "Exactly, Your Majesty. I understand the need for standards and quality control, but the current system seems designed more to exclude than to recognize and integrate the skills that refugee professionals bring to this country." The conversation continued as Dr. Hassan described the emotional toll of her circumstances not just on herself, but on her children. Her daughter, who had been an excellent student in Damascus, was struggling with English and falling behind academically despite her obvious intelligence. Her son, who had been outgoing and confident in Syria, had become withdrawn and was having difficulty making friends at his British school. They asked me why we had to leave their grandfather and grandmother, why we had to come to a place where nobody understands who we really are. They see me working as a cleaner, and they don't understand why their mother, who used to save children's lives, now cleans toilets for a living. How do I explain to them that this is temporary, that we will rebuild our lives, when I'm not certain I believe it myself? The Queen was visibly moved by this aspect of DR. Hassan's story, recognizing how displacement affected not just individuals, but entire families across generations. Your children must be confused by the complete transformation of their circumstances. How do you maintain hope for them when you're facing such overwhelming challenges yourself? I tell them that we are temporarily living a different life, but we are still the same people with the same capabilities and the same dreams. I show them my medical textbooks and explain that I am working to become a doctor again. I help them with their studies and remind them that education is something no one can take away from them, even when everything else is lost. Dr. Hassan then shared something that brought tears to the Queen's eyes. Her daughter had recently told her teacher that her mother was the smartest person in the world, even though she worked as a cleaner, because she had saved children's lives and was studying to do it again. Her son had written a school essay about heroes, describing his mother as someone who had given up everything she loved to keep her children safe. "They understand more than I realized," Dr. Hassan said with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "They see my sacrifice, but they also see my determination. I hope I am teaching them that resilience is possible even when everything seems impossible. The Queen asked Dr. Hassan about her hopes for the future and what changes might make the most difference for refugees in similar situations. Dr. Hassan's responses demonstrated a deep understanding of both the challenges facing refugee professionals and potential solutions that could benefit both the individuals and British society as a whole. If there were programs that could assess our existing skills and provide targeted training to bridge any gaps rather than requiring us to repeat our entire education, we could contribute to British society much more quickly, Dr. Hassan explained. There's a shortage of doctors in this country, particularly in certain specialties. Many refugee doctors could help address this shortage if there were more efficient pathways to credential recognition. The Queen was particularly interested in Dr. Hassan's perspective on cultural integration and what it meant to build a new life while honoring one's original identity. Dr. Hassan spoke eloquently about the complexity of this balance, wanting to become fully British while also maintaining the cultural heritage that was such an important part of her children's identity. I want my children to love this country that has given us safety and opportunity, but I also want them to remember where they came from and to be proud of their Syrian heritage. I want them to grow up as British citizens who also carry the strength and resilience of their ancestors. When their conversation finally concluded after nearly 2 hours, both women were visibly emotional. The Queen had gained insights into the refugee experience that went far beyond anything she had learned from official briefings or charity reports. Dr. Hassan had experienced the profound validation of being truly heard and understood by someone in a position of ultimate authority and influence. Dr. Hassan, the Queen said as they prepared to conclude their meeting, "Your story has taught me things I desperately needed to understand about the experiences of refugees in our country. Your courage in rebuilding your life, your dedication to your children, your determination to practice medicine again. These represent the very best of human resilience. Britain is fortunate to have you." Dr. Hassan stood and formally curtsied, but when she straightened, the Queen stepped forward and embraced her warmly. "I want you to know that this conversation will influence how I think about immigration and refugee policy for the rest of my life. You've helped me understand that when we welcome refugees, we're not just offering charity. We're receiving gifts in the form of skills, perspectives, and human strength that make our country better." As Dr. Hassan was escorted from the castle, the Queen returned to her study with an expression of deep thoughtfulness. When Sarah joined her a few minutes later, she found Her Majesty staring out the window with tears still visible in her eyes. "Sarah," the Queen said without turning from the window, "that conversation has changed my understanding of what it means to lose everything and find the courage to rebuild. Dr. Hassan's story represents a kind of strength I've never had to develop, and her perspectives on integration and belonging have taught me things about my own country that I never understood." Sarah took a seat near the Queen, recognizing that this had been an emotionally challenging but profoundly important conversation. "Dr. Hassan is remarkable, Your Majesty. Her ability to maintain hope and dignity despite such overwhelming challenges is truly inspiring. What strikes me most," the Queen continued, "is how much we're losing as a society when we fail to efficiently integrate the skills and experiences that refugees bring with them. Dr. Hassan could be saving children's lives right now if our systems were better designed to recognize and utilize her existing expertise." The Queen turned to face Sarah directly. "I want to do something about this, Sarah. Not just express sympathy or offer encouragement, but actually work to influence policy changes that could help people like Dr. Hassan rebuild their professional lives more quickly and effectively." This was a significant development in the Queen's transformation. She was moving beyond simply listening and learning toward a desire to actively influence systemic change based on what these personal conversations had taught her. "What did you have in mind, Your Majesty?" "I want to convene a working group that includes refugee professionals, medical educators, policy experts, and government officials to develop better pathways for credential recognition and professional integration. Dr. Hassan's insights should inform policy development, not just private reflection. As Sarah began to consider the implications of such an initiative, she realized that the Queen's encounter with Margaret Thompson had triggered a transformation that was now extending beyond personal growth toward active advocacy for systemic change. The tears shed in this very room had apparently planted seeds that were now growing into concrete action designed to improve the lives of others facing similar challenges. The Queen's willingness to be moved by individual stories and then translate that emotional impact into practical policy initiatives represented a new model of leadership that combined deep personal engagement with strategic action. Sarah felt honored to be supporting this evolution in the Queen's approach to her role and looked forward to seeing how these insights would ultimately benefit people like Dr. Hassan, who were working to rebuild their lives in Britain. 3 months after Margaret Thompson's life-changing visit, Windsor Castle had become a place of transformation not just for the Queen, but for everyone who witnessed her remarkable evolution. Sarah had arranged over 40 private meetings between the Queen and individuals from all walks of life, each conversation adding new dimensions to Her Majesty's understanding of modern Britain. But it was on a crisp February morning that the full significance of this transformation would become clear, when Margaret Thompson returned to the castle for a follow-up meeting that would reveal the true nature of her original visit. Sarah arrived at her office that Tuesday morning to find an unexpected message on her desk. Margaret Thompson had called the previous evening, requesting a meeting with the Queen. What made this unusual was that Mrs. Thompson had specifically asked to see the Queen alone, without Sarah present for any part of the conversation. The request was highly irregular, as the Queen rarely met with anyone without at least one staff member nearby, but the message indicated that the Queen had immediately agreed to the private meeting. As Sarah reviewed the day's schedule, she noticed that the Queen had cleared her entire morning for this single appointment with Margaret Thompson. This level of schedule adjustment was unprecedented for a private meeting with a non-official visitor, and it suggested that whatever Mrs. Thompson had to discuss was of extraordinary importance. When the Queen arrived at her study that morning, Sarah immediately sensed a different energy about her. There was an anticipation, almost a nervousness, that was completely unlike the Queen's usual composed demeanor. Her hands moved restlessly as she reviewed papers, and she checked the time repeatedly, clearly counting down the minutes until Margaret Thompson's arrival. "Your Majesty," Sarah said as she brought in the morning correspondence, "is there anything special I should know about Mrs. Thompson's visit today? You seem particularly focused on this meeting." The Queen looked up with an expression that was difficult to read, part anxiety, part excitement, part something that might have been relief. "Sarah, today's conversation with Mrs. Thompson will likely answer many questions that have been lingering since her first visit. I suspect that after today, both you and I will have a much clearer understanding of why that initial meeting had such a profound impact on me." This cryptic response only deepened Sarah's curiosity, but she recognized that the Queen would share whatever she felt was appropriate after the meeting. At 10 o'clock sharp, the main entrance called to announce Margaret Thompson's arrival, and Sarah went personally to escort her to the Queen's study. Mrs. Thompson appeared different from her first visit. While she still carried her elegant wooden cane and maintained the same dignified bearing, there was a sense of resolution about her, as if she was preparing to complete a mission that had been many years in the making. Her expression carried a mixture of determination and deep emotion that suggested this meeting would be as significant as the first. "Mrs. Thompson," Sarah said as they walked through the corridors, "Her Majesty has been looking forward to your visit all morning. She's cleared her entire schedule to speak with you." "Thank you, Sarah. What I have to share with the Queen today will require time and privacy. I hope you understand that this conversation must remain completely confidential." When they reached the Queen's study, Sarah knocked and announced Mrs. Thompson's arrival. The Queen's invitation to enter was immediate and warm, and when the door opened, Sarah witnessed something extraordinary. The Queen actually stepped forward and embraced Margaret Thompson like an old friend, a gesture of familiarity that was completely unlike her usual formal greetings. "Margaret," the Queen said, using her first name immediately, "I'm so glad you've come back. I've thought about our conversation every day since you were here. Your Majesty, I've been watching the changes in your approach to your role, and I can see that our first conversation had the impact I hoped it would. But there's more to my story that I need to share with you, things that will help you understand why that meeting was so important." Sarah withdrew from the room and closed the door, but not before noticing that both women seemed to be preparing for a conversation of extraordinary significance. The Queen's usual composed demeanor was replaced by an almost eager attentiveness, while Margaret Thompson carried herself with the bearing of someone about to reveal secrets that had been carefully guarded for decades. For the next 2 hours, Sarah worked at her desk while completely private conversations took place behind the closed door of the Queen's study. Unlike previous meetings where she could occasionally hear the murmur of voices, this conversation was conducted in tones so quiet that nothing could be overheard. The silence from the study was so complete that Sarah began to wonder if the meeting was still taking place. At noon, Sarah heard movement from within the study, and a few minutes later, the door opened to reveal both women emerging with tear-stained faces but expressions of profound peace and understanding. The Queen's eyes were bright with emotion, but there was also a sense of completion, as if a long-standing question had finally been answered. Margaret Thompson turned to the Queen one final time before leaving. "Your Majesty, I hope you now understand why it was so important for me to share my complete story with you. The changes you've made in your approach to your role these past months have honored everything I hoped to accomplish." The Queen embraced Margaret Thompson once again, holding her for a long moment before responding. "Margaret, knowing the truth about our connection has transformed my understanding not just of my role, but of my entire life. Thank you for having the courage to come forward after all these years." After Margaret Thompson had been escorted from the castle, the Queen returned to her study and asked Sarah to join her. When Sarah entered, she found the Queen sitting in the comfortable chair where she had conducted so many meaningful conversations over the past months. But her expression carried a depth of emotion that surpassed even the most moving of those encounters. "Sarah," the Queen began, her voice slightly hoarse from emotion, "I need to share with you what Margaret Thompson revealed to me today, because it will help you understand why her first visit had such a profound impact on my approach to my role as Queen." Sarah settled into the chair opposite Her Majesty, recognizing that she was about to hear something of extraordinary significance. "Margaret Thompson is my half-sister." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt the full weight of this revelation settling into her understanding of everything that had transpired over the past 3 months. The Queen continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "In 1943, my father had a brief relationship with a young woman named Catherine Thompson, who was working as a nurse during the war. When Catherine discovered she was pregnant, she made the decision not to tell my father, knowing that such a revelation could have devastating consequences for the monarchy during wartime." Sarah listened in amazement as the Queen explained how Catherine Thompson had quietly left London and given birth to Margaret in a small village, raising her as a single mother while never revealing the identity of her father. Margaret had grown up knowing only that her father had been someone important who could never be part of her life. Margaret spent decades researching her family history, and it was only recently that she discovered the truth about her parentage. She realized that I was her half-sister, and she struggled with whether to come forward with this information. The Queen explained that Margaret had ultimately decided to request a meeting because she wanted to share her life story with the sister she had never known, not to create scandal or seek recognition, but simply to connect with her only living blood relative. The story she had told during that first visit was her own life story, filled with challenges and triumphs that had shaped her into the remarkable woman who had finally found the courage to reach out to the royal family. During our first meeting, Margaret shared her experiences growing up without a father, her mother's struggles as a single parent, her own challenges raising a family while working multiple jobs to make ends meet. She told me about losing her husband to cancer, about helping to raise her grandchildren, about the community service she had dedicated her life to despite never having financial security or social privilege. Sarah began to understand why that initial conversation had moved the Queen to tears. Learning about her sister's life had revealed a completely different experience of living in Britain, one marked by economic struggle, personal loss, and resilience in the face of circumstances that the Queen had never personally encountered. Margaret's story opened my eyes to the reality that my own privileged existence had prevented me from understanding the lives of ordinary people who face real challenges every day. Meeting my sister, hearing about her struggles, and her strength made me realize how isolated I had been from the actual experiences of the people I serve. The Queen explained that Margaret's revelation had prompted her to seek out more stories like her sister's, leading to the series of personal meetings that had transformed her approach to her role. Each conversation had built upon the emotional awakening that began with learning about Margaret's life. Today, Margaret shared the rest of her story, including her discovery of our family connection and her decision to reach out to me. She also told me how proud she has been to watch the changes in my public engagement over these past months, knowing that her courage in coming forward had contributed to helping me become a more effective and compassionate leader. Sarah was deeply moved by this revelation, understanding now why the Queen's transformation had been so profound and lasting. The initial meeting with Margaret Thompson hadn't just been an encounter with a stranger sharing her story. It had been a reunion with a sister whose life experiences represented everything the Queen had never understood about the realities of ordinary life in Britain. Your Majesty, this explains so much about the depth of change we've witnessed in your approach to your role. Learning about your sister's life must have been both deeply personal and profoundly educational. Exactly, Sarah. Margaret helped me understand that my duty as